Welcome to the May 15th, 2024 work session of the McMinnville Water and Light Commission. John, I believe I'm just turning this immediately over to you, yes?
I believe we're going to have Trina, maybe, and then Mark Beauchamp. And
All right, well, Trina, let me turn this meeting over to you then.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Real quick, I'll do a roll call and then I'll introduce UFS for us real quick. So Mayor Dropkin,
I'm here.
Commissioner Tate,
Did you hear me?
nope.
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioner Tankersley,
Here.
Commissioner Gormley,
Here.
and Commissioner Christensen.
Here.
All right, great. So the purpose of today's meeting is to have a work session on our financial reserve policy. Today we have Utility Financial Solutions here with us to kind of lead us through some of the foundational things that go into a financial reserve policy and answer any questions. Based on the feedback that we get today, staff will be working with UFS to draft a policy to bring back to the commission at a future meeting. So we'll go ahead and start. I think Mr. Mark Beauchamp of Utility Financial Solutions is going to share a presentation and get us started.
There we go. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about financial policies, primarily the cash reserve policy, which we refer to as minimum cash reserves. I prepared a presentation, and I know that there's also questions related to the treatment of contributed capital that I want to discuss. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Now, as I go through this presentation, please at any point stop and ask questions because it's really critically important that you get a good understanding and give us the appropriate feedback. Because McMinnville has several unique areas that we want to properly quantify and include in the policies, consistent with what your view is of what you think is in the best interest of the community. Now, on McMinnville, I first want to talk to you. I know a lot of you know who Utility Financial Solutions are. Some of you, I don't know if I've met you before, but we've been around since 2001. And right now, we do almost 20% of all the municipal public power systems in the United States. And we also do work a little bit of international in a sense, Guam, or Barbados, Bermuda, several Caribbean islands. We teach the cost of service courses and the financial planning courses for the American Public Power Association, the American Water Works Association, and American Gas Association. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through what I call our base case scenario, which is it's our standard minimum cash policy that we do in our cost of service studies. It doesn't dive deep. It just goes and quantifies several factors. Sometimes we're brought in to do a more detailed analysis, which is what we're doing here, to get into things that are unique to each utility. So what I'm going to talk about is the importance of a financial reserve policy and the factors that impact it. What factors influence how much cash you should maintain in reserves at a minimum? And then I'll give you that base case example that we use on a financial reserve policy. And what we're really here for more than anything is to get your inputs and to talk about the unique characteristics of McMinnville. Now, before I move on, is there any questions at all? All right. Actually, I'm going to talk, before I even get into this, I want to talk about contributed capital. I want to give you a brief history. I'm going to get into some detail on this, but contributed capital, it's in your financial statements, and you look at depreciation expense.
I think Remy
That
has a
includes.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to say it's difficult to monitor the screen for questions, and so I think when that question is called, I think if people should just jump in. I just wanted to say that for the flow of the meeting, because I think it's just there's so many people in the gallery that it's really hard to see who has upcoming questions. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm gonna give you a brief history of how governmental entities account for contributed assets. When you look at your financial statements today, they have all the depreciation expense, including depreciation expense on assets that were given to the utility. Prior to 1999, that was not the case. In Before that, what they did, if an asset was contributed, it wasn't, if it was placed on the books, it was a separate line item below the financial statements. Or it wasn't even included in the asset calculation at all. And that wasn't really a fair representation because it didn't account for all the assets that the utility had in service. So in 1999, GASB issued pronouncement number 33, which said that contributed capital assets that are contributed, that they need to be placed on the books as an asset and depreciated. And the revenue or the fair market value of that asset, in a sense, would be recorded as a other revenue item on the financial statements. And what happened is, as a result of that, when utilities quantified that depreciation expense on the contributed capital, and that had gone on for several years, utilities found themselves getting challenged, a lot of times under class action lawsuits, because they were double charging customers for that depreciation expense, because customers paid for it up front. And then, so you had zero cash outflow. And then you depreciate over its useful life, recovering the value of that original asset. So in a sense, you double charge customers. So most utility rate makers, what they've done to prevent these challenges in courts, basically, is they've excluded depreciation expense on contributed capital to prevent that double charging. So when we do your financial models, we exclude the depreciation expense on contributed capital so we don't double charge. And as a result, our financial statements that we present to you in the projections are different than what your auditors do, because your auditors are following GASB 33 correctly and putting it in depreciation expense. So, but that's not an appropriate way of doing it for rate making purposes. So does that make sense? Is there any questions about that?
Yeah, I have one, Mark.
Sure.
First of all, it's my understanding, and everybody can correct me if I'm wrong, that our rate making is not subject to getting sued for double counting, if that's what it really is, because we're not regulated by the PUC or anything like that. We have a process. We set our rates. So if the reason for doing this is to avoid getting sued, I don't think that's a big issue for us. And isn't it true that GASB was designed to reflect the reality? In other words, it's being depreciated because not just the ratepayers that contributed, but all the ratepayers have to pay to replace it eventually.
Correct.
So I mean, since we don't really have the problem of getting sued over our rate paying, as long as we follow our process, that goes away. And shouldn't we follow the generally accepted accounting practice, which I think was changed in 99 to reflect the reality of the utilities finances?
Well, I guess to me it was changed because the assets that were recorded on the books were understated. And so they needed to develop a way to get those assets on the book so that people who looked at the financials knew the full amount of assets that were in service by the utility.
But
Um,
doesn't your way understate the depreciation or what it's going to cost in the future to replace assets?
Correct. It does.
And
But
isn't that what reserves are about, to take that into account too?
um, reserves, we'll come to that. Reserves partially, yes, you're correct. The now with contributed capital, if you really for rate making purposes, you can't charge for an asset that you haven't paid for. In other words, you had zero cash outflow. And if you charged the depreciation expense over that useful life, you are now going to, let me give you two examples. I actually tried to put a short one together. Um, let's say that you have two situations. Um, both are assets that cost $100,000. In scenario one, the utility had a cash outflow, which is primarily most of your assets, of $100,000. Say it is a 20-year life, so every year you depreciate $5,000. So for depreciation expense purposes, you've recovered 100,000, so the net is zero. All right, you paid 100, you recovered 100. Under scenario two, if it's donated, your cash outflow initially is zero. If you depreciate it and you include it in your rates, you've recovered $100,000. So you have $100,000 more in income than what you've actually paid. So what has
But
happened
Mark,
is
excuse me, but then when the 20 years is over and you have to replace the asset, if you're going to pay cash like we normally do, under your scenario, we don't have the money. And if you do depreciate it and take it into account, we do have the money, right?
you do, but you have $100,000 more than what you would have had under scenario one.
Well, yeah, I mean that's just math, but I mean, but in terms of what we need, don't we need that $100,000?
Not really, because you haven't paid it.
No. In 20 years, we're going to pay it, right?
Yes. Well, you will pay it in 20 years. That's correct.
And so in 20 years, if we haven't depreciated, then we don't have the $100,000. Where if we depreciated, we have the 100,000 because we've reflected that in our rates, right?
You do, but the the asset was paid for by a customers. So you haven't had a cash outflow to recover. So um you do have to replace it, yes. And at that point, then you have to pay out the $100,000 for whatever it costs to replace it. At that point in time, then you start depreciating it to recover it.
Well, I mean, doesn't yours assume that we're going to borrow the money to pay for it? I mean, doesn't
Either
which we don't do.
um I guess maybe what I probably want to do is to say what do we recover on that in rate making? You have $100,000. What we do recover annually in our rate making process is 3,200, which is the inflationary increase in the assets replacement cost. So what we recover over that period is about $64,000. Now, the asset at that point of time in time will cost 164,000 theoretically. But you have to come up with 100,000.
Right,
I
and we
also
and we
want to
haven't put that money away because our rates haven't reflected the need to replace it as we use this thing up. I mean, you're focusing on we got it for free, but our rates, I think, don't really reflect, what we've paid in the past. They reflect what we're going to need to pay in the future, right?
well, it's both actually. The rates reflect both. It
But I mean,
reflects.
but for things other than depreciated, other than contributed capital, don't our rates reflect what we're going to have to pay in the future, not what we've paid in the past?
It reflects when we look into the future, we say, okay, you need X amount of cash in a sense in 2 years or 3 years from now. And we adjust rates to get you to that point. Now, as a governing body, you have two choices. You can fund that capital replacement in 2 years through reserves and build the money up, or you can try to smooth it out by issuing debt. But that's a decision of the board. But one of the things, even though you are a public power system, you are still susceptible to lawsuits. We've had to defend a lot of different utilities over the years, because municipal systems, because of this very same thing. And that's why we're very sensitive to it.
Okay, I don't want to take everybody's time, so please continue on, unless somebody else has something to say.
Well,
Well,
the
I've
only thing
appreciated,
go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say, I appreciate your thoughts, Tom. I think it's good to think about all of this. So thank you for that.
And
So,
if that was
uh, uh, Chairman Kathy, I have a
Mhm.
question to Mark. Mark, before Tom, right as Tom was asking his question, you were finishing up a statement, and it sounded more like your methodology is more philosophy than it is empirical data. It's a methodology that's based on philosophy rather than pure accounting things. It's your subjective view of
no,
how things should be versus.
it's industry practice.
Is it
It's
okay? I
standard in the
misunderstood. I'm
industry.
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Accounting, I'm a CPA, but I'm going to criticize my profession. Okay. Accounting is done for consistency purposes. And it's done so that if you look at somebody's financial statements and you look at somebody else's, you can compare them because they're done under the same methodology. It's not necessarily a true reflection of the financial condition of the utility. You can get that information out of the accounting data, but you have to manipulate the accounting data. So, that's why you have all these different professions, be it finance, accounting, economics, that all you look at it differently depending on the situation. Now, what I'm giving you is information based on our experience in industry practice, and also to my job is not necessarily to say this is what you have to do. My job is to give you the positives and the negatives. And if the board directs me that you want to recover that, I'm not going to recover it in the way that you're thinking, but I will recover it in a different way through a higher rate of return or different ways in that manner. Because I definitely want to keep you out of the court. I don't want you to get sued over your rates. And but it's your direction that you give us. That's what I'm going to do. All right. It's my job to tell you the good and the bad. Does that make
Mark,
sense?
Mark, I just wanted to make a statement to make sure that we're all on the same page with this. So in rate making right now, we use depreciation to fund projects that we've already paid for that we need to replace in the future. We also use our CIP, our capital improvement plan, to help fund projects that are into the future. So if we're in that second scenario there where somebody has paid for an asset, we're not going to use depreciation to fund it into the future. We're going to use the CIP. And through the CIP, we're going to make sure that we have the money set aside in reserves to be able to pay for that project. Then once we pay for that project in the future, we use the depreciation to replace it again into the future. Is that right?
That's true. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
That was helpful, Trina. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very helpful. That's a good way to explain it.
Okay.
So I'm sorry for that sidetrack, but I know that that's a question. Excuse me. It was presented to me last time I was in McMinnville, and I want to make sure that we may not totally agree, but your direction's what I'm going to do. And like I said, I'm not going to specifically say depreciation expense one for one. I'm going to do it a different way because I want to prevent any kind of potential lawsuits against the rate making methodologies we use. I would do it through a rate of return adjustment, basically.
The other tricky thing about depreciation is that on our financial side of things, when you see the budget, depreciation is included in our operating expenses. And so when we look at operating revenues versus operating expenses, we have depreciation, which is intended to fund capital projects. And that's a huge number. And so it's confusing because we look at operating revenues versus operating expenses, but when you have this huge depreciation line item included in there, which is where it has to be, it's confusing because that isn't set aside to fund future capital. So we try to separate operations from capital, but yet in our financial statements, it's very difficult to do. So it's just another important thing to take a look at when we're like, oh, our operating expenses aren't meeting our operating revenues. Well, a big reason for that is because we have to reflect depreciation and operating expenses. So just another thing to keep in mind.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to on this. I wanted to make sure that issue was at least discussed. So you guys can think about it. If you want me in the future to include it, I can go forward with that, but I'll do it a different way. Okay. So now back to the financial reserve policy. What a financial reserve policy does is, one of the things with municipalities and municipally owned utilities is, especially because they're part of a city and they don't necessarily understand the utilities need for cash and cash reserves, because the utilities cost structure is so much different than like a general fund of the city. You have a lot of investments in assets that need to be replaced and repaired and accounted for moving forward. So, a lot of times when it comes to cash, there's two things that happen. The utility's in trouble if they don't have enough cash, because rates are going to have to go up. They get themselves in trouble if they have too much cash, because either the governing body, a lot of times it's the city council, or the customers look at that cash balance and they don't understand the reasons why they need to maintain that much cash. All right. So what a cash reserve policy does is it identifies what cash the utility needs to maintain, but even more important than that, it educates others, if they read the policy, as to why the utility needs to maintain that cash. And so what the cash reserve policy does is, how much cash do we need to maintain at a minimum? And once that's identified, and I know your utility is debt adverse, but when you look forward into the future and you have a large capital expenditure and it takes your cash reserves down below that minimum, what it does is it identifies the how much debt you need to issue or the timing of the debt. So it gives you a more broader financial picture than just saying this much cash. It also identifies how much debt you should issue. Okay. So when it comes to cash, and remember, I keep talking about minimums, all right? The how much cash does a utility need to maintain at a minimum to make sure you can pay your bills in a timely fashion? The first item, which is it's something called working capital lag. And what working capital lag is, it's the timing difference between when you pay a bill and get money from customers. Give me an example of that. You go all through the month of January paying for labor, materials, supplies. At the end of the month, say you read all the meters, and the first week of February, you send out the bills. You don't get that money until the second week of March, but you paid the cash in January. So that there's that working capital lag, which is traditionally about 45 days for a utility that bills monthly. So that's the first thing that's quantified. Then we look at purchase power cost. We want to make sure that your highest purchase power bill that you receive during the course of the year is also in your reserves. And I know you don't have debt, but if you had a debt service payment, we want your highest debt service payment in your reserves at all times. Because when you have a debt service payment, it's usually paid twice a year. One is an interest only payment, and the other one is principal and interest. And of course, the principal interest payment is higher, and that we want in your reserves at all times. Then you have your capital improvement programs. Let's say you have a $5 million capital plan over the next 5 years in total. We want to make sure that you have enough cash in your reserves at the start of the construction season that you can start and finish that capital project with the cash that you have in your reserves. Okay. So then there's this
Excuse
other
me, Mark,
oh,
just
go
a
ahead.
quick clarification here. So do you only look forward 5 years in setting rates for capital improvements for reserves?
Our models go out like 30 years.
Oh, okay,
But we
great. Thank you.
typically only show 5 years. We can show more. Part of the
Well,
reason we only show 5 years, when you start looking too far out, I mean, anybody that does financial projections know that when you look short term, 2, 3 years out, you're pretty close. When you start getting beyond that, the only thing you're certain of is you're going to be wrong because it's built in all these assumptions.
Okay.
So
Right, but quick question. So to make sure I understand, you when you set reserves, you only look 5 years ahead. Is that correct? For capital
that's
improvement?
what we present, yes. But we do
Okay,
look further out. Like in your situation, I'd probably want to look further out.
okay.
And the
I mean,
reason
we
oh, go
did
ahead.
that when we raised the dam, for instance. We did that because we squirreled money away for a long time, and we actually had to borrow some money even at that way to do it. But for years and years, we squirreled money away. So, and that wasn't a 5-year projection. I understand you can't predict what the cost is going to be accurately, but you can know it's going to be there, and you can set aside a reasonable guess for what it is.
No, I totally agree. And that's something what I want to do in the water department, we're looking forward is to do a longer term because I know that you're looking at some major capital improvements when you get out 5, 10 years. And I think that one of the key issues for the commission is how is that going to be funded? You're very fortunate. You have good cash reserves and the timber revenue definitely helps that. But how do we go from over the next 10 years, once that capital plan is needed, how are we going to fund it? Part of it through cash, part of it through debt. What
Mhm.
is the commission's plan for that? And that's one of the things that we need to work with the commission on in developing that strategy.
So we've asked, or we've given Mark our master plan, which is a 20-year plan. So that's what we were looking at as staff.
If we go back in history, we had at one time when Bob Payne was on the council and Al Hampson, some questions about why we're, the amount of capital that we were building at the point. And so I remember Dave Hoggerberg sitting down with the board, and we started listing projects, and we ended up listing projects about 3 times the amount of cash we had. So the council at the time, that helped him understand what we were doing in that. So I think, John, your comment about a 20-year thing, I mean, that's really been historically how we've had stuff setting out.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to show you on the next. We'll use that 20-year plan. So you get a better picture moving forward. This is just an example slide of how a cash reserve policy helps identify when debt needs to be issued. On the blue line, I like this. The blue line here, this is the cash balances. And let's say that your capital program drives your cash below the red line. The red line is your minimum cash reserve policy. And let's say you're also meeting your target operating income in a sense, which is the ideal target for rate setting. Then that once these cross, that's when debt needs to be issued at this point to try to fund that, to keep the reserves above the minimum. All right. When we determine revenue requirements, we determine minimums and maximums. The minimums is we have to maintain a certain amount of cash, also debt coverage ratio. That's an issue in McMinnville, but those are the minimums. We have to set rates high enough to achieve that. The upper boundary is that optimal operating income target. Okay. And so we try to keep the rate adjustments between those two targets, but we don't like to exceed the optimal operating income target because when we do that, we are at that point overcharging customers because they're paying more than they should for the infrastructure they're using today. All right. So that's why that's becomes our upper boundary. So that then tells us when we need to issue debt. Okay?
So Mark, can I interrupt you a minute? So you said
Absolutely.
charging too much. Let me ask you, what if the pricing you put together is still below market? Does that fit in there anywhere?
Market is something that now I'm going to talk theoretical. Okay. Market is something that if you're below market, if you're a private company, that you can adjust your prices upward. All right. We're a public power system, so that's not a public utility. So that's not really what we're after. We want to make sure that we're financially stable, rates are stable moving forward. So there's more of a balance there. And the thing with market, when you look at it, what happens with utilities is if you built a water plant 20 years ago and you paid off the debt, your rates are probably going to be lower than the surrounding communities. Then all of a sudden you build a new water system plant and you have that new debt service, and now your rates are going to be above the area communities in other, in your area. And so it's very dependent on where you are in that cycle, asset cycle, life cycle of the assets. If you have newer assets, traditionally you're going to have higher rates. If you have older assets during that period, you probably have lower rates until you make the next improvement. So, and that's where that balance is, and that's where that 20-year plan comes so much into play, because we're able to project when the assets are older and need to be replaced, so we can start setting funds aside to prevent that big jump in rates moving forward.
But Mark, in our case, we've been a little bit unique in that because we haven't had those kind of issues.
Correct. Yep.
Because we have done
Yeah.
the planning so far ahead.
Yep.
And Mark, I remember several years ago when we wwillamette talking about the Willamette River source, that you very persuasively said that at some point we probably should use some debt financing, because otherwise our rates are going to be, we have to have a huge drop in rates once we finish doing it if we finance it as we go. And that made sense to me. But the question is, don't we also have to be careful, because if we borrow money, we mess up the city's ability to borrow money?
Not necessarily. Depends on the type of debt that's issued. In
But
other words,
I understand, well, there's general obligation or not. We wouldn't do that, but doesn't that show the city, if we borrowed a whole bunch of money, wouldn't that show the city's balance sheet having more debt? Because they do a combined financial statement, and I remember being told this. I vaguely remember being told this over the years.
well, it's shown on the capper of the city, but it isn't anything that would limit the city's ability to finance their own projects.
Okay, so it doesn't.
Being,
So if we have a bunch of debt that shows up on the city's balance sheet, that doesn't either increase their rates or make it harder for them to borrow money. Okay,
no,
I
it's a different
remember
entity.
incorrectly, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, these are great questions. So cash reserves, minimum cash. One of the things we're often asked to do is to develop a target cash balance, or how much the target should be. And that's something we really can't, I can't say we can't do it. We probably could theoretically, but our objective is to define the minimums and to keep you above it. The question then as a commission is do you want an upper boundary? We don't recommend having an upper boundary of cash, and knowing the commission, you don't want that anyway. But that is at times we have to define a maximum also. That's something that's very subjective, and we don't recommend it. And that's not an issue, I don't think, here. Let's see, this is the maximum. I'm going to, because there is one thing I haven't talked about. I talked about working capital lag. I talked about capital improvements, debt service. What I didn't talk about was unexpected events, catastrophic events. Be it an ice storm, a windstorm, a hurricane, there's always unexpected expenses that occur. Some are small, can be very large. And in a cash reserve policy, we look at or try our best, because it's more recognizing it than it is quantifying it, that bad things happen. And our objective is to make sure you have enough cash in your reserves, that if you had a major catastrophic event, that you had enough money in your reserves to start the repair and replacement process. until adequate financing can be arranged. All right. So we do look at potential risk of the utilities, be it a pump failure or a transformer, or it could be an ice storm or a windstorm. And we do that by looking at the age of the infrastructure. We feel that if you have older infrastructure, you're more at risk of having unexpected things occurring than if you have newer infrastructure. So you're on the newer side. So we feel your risk levels are low. So we usually give you the highest risk rating in a sense because of the age of your assets being relatively new.
So,
Excuse me, Mark. I think we have to be careful of that. I'm at an NWPPA conference, and yesterday, Emerald PUD talked about their experience in the recent ice storm, and there were two waves of the storm, and in the second wave, it took down a bunch of the brand new poles and equipment they'd put up. So those things, the age of those were a matter of days. So I'm concerned that, for things like that, and I agree with you that in some sense, the age of the infrastructure makes sense because you have old poles that are going to break better. But I think we should be careful of that.
And that's something that, again, it's if you feel that that number should be changed, then that is something that this policy is something. I'm just giving you standards, or not our standards, really, but we want to make it specific to what you feel is needed.
Right.
And so that factor can be changed. Even though we may have assigned a 1%, which is our lowest risk factor, you may want a 3 or a 5% for
so
various
Mark,
reasons.
I can give you an example. I know the ice storm Tom was talking about. There was a Springfield Utility Board down in Springfield. Their last estimate I heard for that storm was $8 million. And, that would essentially wipe out a quarter of our reserves.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And John, I think Emerald was $11 million.
Yeah, I had heard 10, but I hadn't heard the final number.
We did work for a utility in Nebraska. It was the biggest public power district in Nebraska, and called Southern. Anyway, they let their infrastructure get older. I mean, it was like ready to fall down. Ice storm came, did about $50 million worth of damage. FEMA picked up most of it. They got kind of fortunate in that. So sometimes being an older infrastructure can pay off. That's not what I would recommend, though.
Good.
So this is kind of our standard format that we use in our cost of service models. We look at the O&M expense. Remember that 45-day working capital lag. Power costs, the highest purchase power bill that occurs throughout the year. The historical investments and assets, which really is the quantification of that catastrophic type event, usually between 1% to 3%. Your debt service payment, that highest debt service payment in the 5-year capital plan. We take the total 5-year capital plan, net of debt bond proceeds, and divide it by 5. You probably say, why do you do that? Because it goes up and down every year, right? Well, the issue is, and I know there's engineers and they're great. We need them, but their eyes tend to be bigger than what they can actually spend in a year. So the capital plans tend to be front loaded. You're not going to give me a hard time, are you, John?
I was thinking there about it. I don't know. We try.
So, yeah.
I don't think I think it might be the supply chain that's really getting in the way in the last few years.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So what we do is we approach it more from the standpoint that we know these capital improvements are needed, but the timing of it's probably not going to match up that closely. And so we take the 5-year program, we divide it by 5. Say we want that in our reserve, even though on a year-to-year basis it's going to go like this. That makes sense. There's
Yeah, the
another
smoothing
reason.
makes sense. Yeah, the smoothing makes sense, Mark.
Yeah. Let's see. I've talked about this, the working capital. Like what I really want to do is get into um the the uniqueness of McMinnville. Because that's really you have so many things that are unique from the standpoint that you have two very large customers in electric that you're at risk if something were to happen to them financially, that you're at risk for their purchase power bill that they've created. Then that's one situation. Then you have market risk. You don't have the market risk. You have some that other utilities have. When I say market risk, what I mean is um, variability in purchase power costs because of fuel prices or market prices, because BPA kind of shelters you from a lot of that variation or fluctuation. I mean, you get some, but not as much as other areas. But that
But
is
Mark,
always, oh, go ahead.
on that, we do have risks from BPA. We have a financial reserve surcharge potential, and we have the cost recovery adjustment clause, the crack. So there is risk in our power supply that BPA can raise our rates during the year at pretty much any time.
And we should probably recognize that if the commission wants us to put some factor in to recognize that that risk exists. And usually, like for most utilities, I am going to protect the utility from market risk by implementing a power cost adjustment. Of course, you don't have a power cost adjustment, so that puts you at greater risk. And so what we probably want to do is to recognize that risk is there and we don't have a mechanism in place to recover it.
And
Excuse
John,
me, John. Oh, sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
oh, no, it's okay. I was just gonna say, I feel like with what has happened in the last few years, that has potentially gotten much more, there's much more risk involved than there was previously. And it looks like it's going in that direction for the foreseeable future. Like that risk is going to continue to grow. And I think at a fast pace, right, John?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
And John, when does the Bonneville contract get renegotiated? Because we've got risk from that, right?
2028, but they'll want us to sign contracts, I think, at the end of 25. I think that's right, Jamie.
Right.
So we'll have a good idea what it's going to be at that point.
Like, but we have some risk within that 5-year period now, right?
Correct. Well, yeah, and we also have risk.
End of it.
And we also have risk in the fact that we will probably be moving, to some load will be moving to tier 2. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty in our power supply now.
Sorry, I'm writing notes.
So the question would be for Mark, how we create the wrong word here, kind of defensible standards as we consider these new elements. I want to make sure that we're being really thoughtful about that and memorializing that in our thought process so that it's not so that it's shown that we're backing this up with as much information as we have. It's data driven. It's a a standard to address the risk so that it's not the questions can be answered about why the commission may be making these changes.
The how we've done it for other utilities is like the market risk is we look at what the potential high side risk is. In other words, if market prices go to $500 a megawatt hour compared to what they're currently paying. And so we quantify that, and then we look at how long it would take to get rate relief on that. So it's a combination of the risk and how long it's going to take to mitigate it. So, and that's the piece that we want to look at. Geographical
By rate relief,
consideration.
Mark, just to make sure I understand, by rate relief, you mean raising our rates?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Then geographical considerations, if I'm in Florida, I got substantial risk for hurricanes and stuff. So my risk factors might be larger if I'm in Florida because of the hurricanes, or I'm even on the East Coast. Your area, I don't know if you have ice storms and wind storms. I don't know if you have extreme exposure. Probably on the lower side compared to other parts of the U.S. I could be wrong.
We have some, but it's not. But it's very system dependent, and so we don't have the hurricane type, but we have had Columbus Day storm in 1962. We did have some pretty big storms here. It's just not as frequent.
Yeah.
And then there's it's a hopefully remote risk, but catastrophic potentially of earthquake.
Right.
Here.
Yes.
And I think, Mark, when you mentioned earlier that FEMA covered the cost of the Nebraska storm, FEMA's the length of payback on that could be years. So we want to keep that in mind as well. If there is Cascadia is something that will happen, and so we need to be aware of that as well.
Yeah, we're still working with FEMA on the 2021 ice storm. So that's 3 years.
Yeah, they typically cover about 60%, and then it takes 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
I just want to highlight for everyone that we have just over 5 minutes left.
I think we just got 3 more things really to talk about. The next one's a major one though.
Yeah, Kathy, this is it. I got to step away from the dais. So thank you all, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you.
Bye, Ed.
Bye.
For water, excuse me. This next one is huge. It's the alternative revenue sources. And what I'm referring to there is the timber revenues. And what I believe, just in past discussions with the commission, is that we want to make sure that timber revenue is set aside for future capital improvements. And so what I was thinking about doing with that is to take and create, at least for accounting purposes, excuse me, a fund that goes into that we would quantify that and say this is specific set aside for future capital. So the minimum cash is going to adjust annually based on how much timber revenue gets put in. Because I think that's kind of what one of your major objectives. If I'm
Yes.
Yeah, and Mark, I think that's correct. But we have to recognize, I think, that there is a risk to that source of capital as a revenue stream. One, heaven forbid, a fire up there. 2, windstorm, and 3, we're very careful to try to mitigate this, but every once in a while there's a movement in Oregon to no harvesting on watersheds, And we hope that we are good stewards of our watershed and that we can prove that, but that would be a statewide thing. I'm sure that the county or the city wouldn't do that, but the state might, based on somebody else messing up. So I think you're right. We need to set that aside that way, but I think we also need to factor in that that's not 100% certain income stream. Plus, of course, timber prices.
Yeah. I think we've been talking about that quite a bit, and I think that there's different ideas we have on how that would come into play in the cash reserve policy moving forward. There's another thing like McMinnville, you guys have experienced a fair amount of growth, and growth can be good or bad. Depends on what your line extension policies are, how they're structured. What I mean by that is there's some utilities around the country, they pay 100% of the extension cost.
We don't do that.
And others that the customer pays 100%. So there's both ends of the spectrum. And then there's other growth that can affect like substations that really aren't even part of the line extension policies. But growth is another thing that can cause upward pressure on a utility's need for cash. That's normally quantified as part of the capital improvement program, but it is something that, we probably want to consider or look at. And then there's social considerations, and social considerations are oftentimes something it's related to the community's perception of cash for the utilities, and what we like to try to do is in our cash reserve policies is to say, okay, this amount gets set aside for repair and replacement. And the reason is so that money has a purpose. So if somebody questions why you have so much cash, you can go back and say, this is why, because we need to set that aside to replace these assets. So one of the things I'm going to have is, do you want to establish a repair and replacement account? Believe me, it's only for accounting purposes. It doesn't mean that, it just says from the accounting that this cash is in this account, but it's all in the same checkbook, so to speak. It's more for accounting, but more for purposes of presentation to the public, if anybody asked.
Mark, wouldn't that already be in our minimum reserve policy calculation, like Jody talked about? Wouldn't that already be there rather than changing our financial statements?
You are correct. It would be in the financial policy that we develop.
Yeah. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I think Jody correctly pointed out that we need to have that so we can defend what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for because when we're talking about really complex systems in the budgeting and how we think about long horizons of time, it is imperative that the commission create ways for the community to access this information and understand it. So the more detail we can have on the reserve and what the purpose of the reserve is, as opposed to sort of generally it's there if we need it, right? I think we have to have that detail. I think it's the right thing to do as far as the ability for future commissioners to understand the intent of decisions. I think documenting all of this process is important.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to wrap up, a great thought to end on. And it is 8 o'clock. So unless anybody has something absolutely burning that they need to bring forward, I'll just pause in case anyone does.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes, Mr. Beauchamp, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Thank you, everybody, for the great dialogue. Commissioner Tankersley, thank you for the great questions and thoughtful ideas you brought forward. And I will close the work session at 8 a.m.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate
Thank
it. Bye-bye.
you.